Hello and welcome to my channel Amoeba Savant. We are starting book 3 of the Brothers Karamazov, and please subscribe, and if you'd like to watch this whole series of each chapter, go to the playlist and then press play and it will play all of them in order for you. This is book 3, The Sensualists, chapter 1, In the Servants' Quarters. Although it was far from the center, Fyodor Karamazov's house was not altogether on the outskirts of town. Rather old and weather-beaten, but still pleasant-looking, it was a 2-story gray house with a red iron roof. Old as it was, it seemed solid enough to last many years, and the inside was spacious and comfortable. It had many closets, snug little corners, unexpected little stairways and passages. It had some rats, too, but Karamazov didn't really mind them. "You don't feel quite so lonely in the evenings with them around," he used to say. He was usually alone at night, since he sent the servants off to their quarters in a cottage on the grounds, locking himself in until morning. The servants' cottage was in the yard, and it too was solidly built and quite roomy. It was in the kitchen of the cottage that Karamazov's meals were prepared. There was a kitchen in the main house, but he disliked the smell of cooking, so his food had to be carried across the yard all year round, summer and winter. The house must have been built for a very large family, for it could easily have accommodated 5 times as many people, masters and servants, as it ever had since Karamazov had owned it. And now the main house was occupied only by Fyodor Karamazov and his son Ivan, and the cottage by only 3 servants, old Gregory, his wife Martha, and another, younger manservant called Smerdyakov. At this point it is necessary to say a few words about these 3 servants. We have already met old Gregory. He was a steadfast, resolute man who would stubbornly and unwaveringly follow a course once, for some reason often extremely illogical, he had decided it was incontrovertibly right. On the whole, he was an honest and incorruptible man. His wife, Martha, although she always submitted to her husband's decisions in the end, often nagged him mercilessly. For instance, after the emancipation of the serfs, she tried to persuade Gregory to leave Mr. Karamazov, move to Moscow, and open a little store with their savings. But Gregory decided then and there that his wife was talking nonsense because all women were dishonest. That was a quote. That it would be improper to leave the master whose serf he had been, whether that master was a good or a bad man, that it was their duty to stay with him now. "Don't you know what duty means, woman?" "I know what duty means, Gregory, but I don't see why it's our duty to stay here. That don't make sense to me," Martha objected firmly. "So it don't make sense to you? We're still staying here, and don't bring it up again." And that's the way it was. They stayed. Mr. Karamazov named the wages he'd pay, and paid them regularly. Besides, Gregory knew that he had a certain influence over his master. He gauged quite correctly that, although his clownish master was a very strong and obstinate man in some respects, in others he was surprisingly weak. Karamazov himself was aware of his weak points. There were many things that frightened him, and he worried constantly, and this would have made it hard if he had not had someone who was loyal to him, and Gregory was as loyal a man as anyone could hope to have. In the course of Karamazov's life there had been many occasions when he had been in danger of being beaten, sometimes quite badly, but every time Gregory came to his rescue, although afterward the old servant would always admonish him at great length. But Gregory meant much more to Karamazov than a means of avoiding beatings. There were moments when, for some complex and subtle reasons that he himself could not explain, he felt an urgent and pressing need to have someone loyal and trustworthy by him. Some of these times were of a rather morbid nature. Debauched in his sensuality and often cruel, like some vicious insect, Karamazov was occasionally, especially when drunk, subject to moments of mental anguish, of torment arising from a feeling of guilt that made him feel his soul was hurting him physically, so to speak. "It feels as if my soul had got caught in my throat and was quivering there," was the way he sometimes described it. It was at such moments as these that he wanted someone somewhere close to him, not necessarily in the same room. In the servants' quarters was good enough. Someone firm and faithful, someone quite unlike his dissipated self, someone who, aware of all his goings-on and knowing all his secrets, would still tolerate it all out of sheer loyalty, would not try to stop him, and would make neither reproaches nor, above all, threats by bringing up all the horrible retributions to come in this world or the next. And again, in case of need, he wanted someone to protect him from something unknown but terrifying. What Karamazov actually needed was to have near him another human being, someone who had known for a long time, someone friendly, someone he could call on in a painful moment just to look into his face, perhaps exchange a few words, sometimes completely extraneous words. Then he would be relieved to see that the faithful man was not angry, or if he was angry, well, then he would feel a little sad about it. Sometimes, though very seldom, Karamazov would even go over to the servant's cottage, wake Gregory up, and ask him to come over to the house for a few minutes. Then he would just talk to him about complete trifles and let him go, perhaps even with a sarcastic remark or a sneer, after which he would shrug, go to bed, and sink into the sleep of the just. When Alyosha came to live with his father, Mr. Karamazov felt rather the same way about him. Alyosha, quote, touched his very heart by being there, seeing everything, condemning nothing, end quote. Moreover, Alyosha offered his father something that he had never had before, a complete absence of contempt for him. Indeed, Alyosha treated him with invariable kindness and a completely genuine and sincere affection, which Karamazov little deserved. All this came as a complete surprise to the old profligate. Let me know what that means in the comments. Who led a bachelor's life and who, until then, had known only wicked joys. And when Alyosha left his house, his father understood and admitted himself something he had refused to understand before. I have already mentioned at the beginning of my story that while Gregory had hated Fyodor Karamazov's first wife, Dmitri's mother, Adelaida, he had sided with Sophia, the crazy one, his master's second wife, against the master himself or against anybody who said anything deprecating or slighting about her. His sympathy for that unhappy woman had turned into a sort of sacred cause for him, so that even 20 years after her death, he would not let a disparaging remark about her go unchallenged. Outwardly, Gregory appeared to be a cold, grave man whose words were few but weighty and trenchant. And it would have been hard to tell at first glance whether he loved his patient and obedient wife, although in fact he did love her, and she was well aware of it. As to Martha, she was no fool. Indeed, she was probably more intelligent than her husband, and certainly much more practical in life. Nevertheless, from the beginning of their married life, she had given in completely to his wishes, and she respected him for his moral superiority. The remarkable thing about this couple was that they spoke to each other very little, except on the most pressing and important matters. Pompous and solemn as he was, Gregory always pondered over his affairs and troubles in silence, and Martha had understood once and for all that he did not want her advice. She felt that her husband appreciated her discretion and took it as a sign of her intelligence. He had never used physical force on her, except once, and then only for form's sake. It was during the first year of Karamazov's marriage to Adelaida. The village girls, who were still serfs at the time, had gathered in their master's yard to sing and do some folk dancing. When they began singing, Martha, who was still a young woman at the time, dashed forward in front of the singers to do the Russian dance, which she performed not as the ordinary village girls did, but as she had been trained to do by a Moscow dancing master in the private theater of her former masters, the wealthy Musovs. Gregory watched his wife perform in silence, but later at home he pushed her around a bit and pulled her hair. That was all, however, and he never touched her again. Besides, after that, Martha gave up dancing altogether. God had not blessed them with children. They had had one, but he had died. This was particularly hard for Gregory, who loved children and was not ashamed to show it. After Adelaida's elopement, he took the 3-year-old Mitya into his cottage and looked after him himself, combing his hair and washing him in a trough. And later he did the same for Vanya and Alyosha, for which he was rewarded by having his face slapped, as I recounted earlier. As to his own children, he was only happy during the time his wife was pregnant, for when his son was born, Gregory was filled with grief and despair. The boy had 6 fingers. Gregory was so overwhelmed that he did not speak one word until the christening, spending most of his time out of the house, away from everybody. It was spring, and during those 3 days he spent his time digging in the vegetable garden. On the day the boy was to be christened, Gregory was struck by an idea. As he entered the servants' cottage, where the priest and the guests had already gathered and where Mr. Karamazov had appeared to act as godfather, Gregory suddenly announced, "There's no need to christen him at all." "Oh, there's no need to christen him at all." He said it quietly, letting the words out one by one, and giving no further explanation, stared blankly at the priest. "What has made you decide that?" the priest asked, amused. "Because he's a dragon," Gregory muttered. "Why a dragon? What are you talking about?" Gregory remained silent for a while. "Because nature," he mumbled, "got mixed up." Although his words were slurred and rather hard to understand, his tone was firm and he obviously did not wish to add anything more. They all laughed and, of course, the poor baby was christened. Gregory prayed at the font with great zeal, but he did not change his mind about the newborn child. During the 2 weeks that the poor sickly boy lived, Gregory never interfered with anything. In fact, he hardly even looked at his son, apparently trying not to notice him, and spent as much time as possible out of the house. When at the end of the 2nd week the boy died of thrush, however, Gregory put him in the coffin himself, looking at his son with infinite sadness, and when the shallow little grave had been filled, he knelt down and bowed to the ground. Since that time he had never mentioned his son, nor had Martha done so in his presence. Indeed, whenever she happened to talk about her little baby, someone or other, she did so in a whisper, even though Gregory was out of earshot. Martha noticed that, after their child was buried, Gregory spent a great deal of time on godly things. He would often put on his large, round, silver-rimmed glasses and read, mostly to himself, from the Lives of the Saints. Only very rarely, on a few occasions during Lent, would he read some passage aloud. He was particularly fond of the book of Job, and he had somehow got hold of a copy of the sayings and sermons of our God-bearing father Isaac of Syria, which he read perseveringly for many years, although he hardly understood a word. But then he may have revered and loved the book so much for just that reason. Lately he had become interested in the teachings of the Flagellants, having met some members of that sect in the vicinity. Apparently they impressed him considerably, but he did not deem it proper to embrace a new faith. His reading of godly things lent his face an even graver expression. It is possible that Gregory was naturally inclined toward mysticism, so that the birth of his 6-fingered son, followed by the boy's death, and other strange and unexpected event, left a mark on him, as he put it himself. On the night after the child's funeral, Martha was awakened by what she took to be the crying of a newborn baby. She was frightened and awakened her husband. He listened and thought it sounded more like moaning. Could be a woman. He got up and pulled on some clothes. It was a warm May night, and as he stepped out onto the porch to listen, he heard clearly that the moans were coming from the garden. Yet he knew that the gate between the garden and the yard, the only way into the garden, had been padlocked for the night, and that no one could have climbed over the solid, very tall fence. He returned to his cottage to get a lantern and the key to the padlock. Ignoring his wife's frightened and hysterical protest that they were the cries of her little baby calling, Gregory went into the garden. Once there, he realized that the moans were coming from the bathhouse near the garden gate, and that it was a woman moaning. He opened the door of the bathhouse and was stunned by what he saw. The local god's fool, known throughout the area as Reeking Lizaveta, had hidden herself in the Karamazovs' garden bathhouse where she had just given birth to a baby boy, and now she lay dying beside her newborn baby. She did not say anything since she had never been able to speak. But all this needs further explanation. And that's the end of chapter 1 of book 3. Please subscribe, please like this video, and share with anybody you think would love this series. And I'll see you in the next video where I read chapter 2 called Reeking Lizaveta. See you then. Bye.